Good.
All right, well, I'm going to pick up where Stephanie left off and just say that I do teach the Constitution classes that I teach. I always base it on the original intent of our founders, which is actually easy to, I'm sorry, lost my train of thought here. It's actually easy to prove because they were such prolific writers. So we have no doubt what their intent was for each part of the Constitution. Now, when I teach history, I also use original source documents. Now, do you all know what I mean by original source documents? Okay. And then I use historians that also use historical documents, original source documents as well. Now, because this is an historical society, I decided to concentrate my talk on history. In fact, this presentation is titled The Battle for Truth in History. So let me begin with the worldview battle, or the battle for truth that is taking place in our nation in the area of history. And here is the battle up on the screen. The battle for truth is between the biblical foundation of our nation, which leads to freedom, peace, and prosperity, versus the secular or man-made foundation, which leads to chaos and confusion. Now, most people today, especially our young people, don't even know about the biblical foundation of our nation because we no longer teach it in our schools or even in our churches. But we should, because contained in the biblical foundation are the freedom principles that have made America the most free and prosperous nation in the history of the world. In other words, this battle is an issue about freedom. Freedom. In fact, if you come to my classes, that's what I always emphasize. This is about freedom. Now, in case you have not been taught that our nation's foundation was based on the Bible, let me give you some proof. So take out your Declaration of Independence handout, and I want you to look at the second line and the beginning of the third line. What does it say there? What does it say there, Jerry? You want to read that?
Are you at second line or second sentence?
Well, I have second line.
The laws of nature and of nature's God.
Right, the laws of nature and of nature's God. Now, this phrase is not familiar to us today, right? Have any of you ever heard of it?
No.
Okay, I have never had a class, unless the person had taken my class before, that knew what this phrase meant. But it was understood by every legal scholar at the time the Declaration was written. They knew what it was because it was defined in Blackstone's commentaries, the most relied upon textbook used in their law schools. Now, what this phrase tells us is that the basis of our nation's laws is the laws of nature and of nature's God. But what does it mean? How was it defined in Blackstone's commentaries? Well, look up on the screen, and I have defined the first part of the phrase called the laws of nature. Now, there is a lot written about this phrase in Blackstone's commentary, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to summarize what was written. And it means those laws instinctively known to man. It is written on his heart and his conscience and is revealed in nature. Now let's take a look at the second part of that phrase, the laws of nature's God. And this what it means according to Blackstone's commentaries. And I'm not summarizing here. This is a direct quote out of the commentaries. It says, these doctrines are to be found only in the Holy Scriptures. So the laws of nature's God refers to the moral law contained in God's Word. And the Ten Commandments are the basis of that moral law. In fact, that's why the Ten Commandments were placed in our courthouses and used to be hung in our public schools up until 1980 to serve as memorial stones or reminders as to the foundation of our laws. And then to sum it up, in Blackstone's commentaries, it says this: on these two foundations, the law of nature and the law of revelation, or they're talking about the Bible here, depend, listen to this, depend all human law. So you can see here our laws have a biblical origin. Now, not only do our laws have a biblical origin, but our form of government does too. So now we're going to take a look at the second paragraph of the Declaration, and contained in that paragraph is the philosophy of our nation's government, which again is based on biblical principles. So this first part, I want you to read along with me. So if you get out your Declaration of Independence, let's read it together. Or you can look up on the screen too. Wow, that's big. Okay, you ready? It says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All right, so what does this say? It acknowledges that there is a God, and what is God called here?
Creator.
Creator, right. And God the Creator endows us with what? What is He the source of? What does it tell us here?
Unalienable rights.
Unalienable rights. Now, I know you've all heard that phrase before, correct? But have you ever thought about what it means? Because what it means is very important. Does anybody want to take a guess? All right, this is what it means. It means they are rights that cannot be taken away. And the reason they cannot be taken away is because they are given to us by God. Unless, of course, a person chooses to forfeit those rights by breaking the law or taking away the rights of another person. All right, so what are the three rights that are listed? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, correct?
Mm-hmm.
All right, now, are those the only unalienable rights that we have?
No.
No. Does anybody know where the rest of them are listed, or some more of them are listed? The first 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights, or that is the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. We can find other listings such as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to bear arms, due process rights. There's all kinds of rights listed in there, but you know what? They're not all even in there. There's other rights that they couldn't list all of them. All right. Now, this principle that God gives us rights is very, very important. Because if we don't believe God is the source of our rights, then guess who will determine them? Okay. Or, well, let's go back to our battle for truth, right? Then they are going to be man-made rights given to us by government, correct? That is the battle of truth in this area. And the bad part about that is a government that can give rights can also take them away. All right, that's the danger of man-made rights. So if our God-given rights are so important to liberty, then how did our founders believe they should be protected and secured? Well, we don't have to look far because the next statement in the Declaration of Independence actually answers that very question. So let's pick up where we left off and let's read the next phrase. It says that to secure these rights, meaning our unalienable rights, governments are instituted among men. So whose job is it to secure our rights? What does it say?
Government.
It is the government's job to protect our God-given unalienable rights. Did you know that is the main purpose of government? And the reason why God instituted government. But unfortunately today, the government that is supposed to be protecting our rights is actually becoming the greatest threat to them. All right, so let's take a look at the very next clause, and then we'll be done. It says, deriving their just powers, they're talking about government powers, from the consent of the governed. So where does the government get its powers?
In the people.
We the people. That's what consent of the governed means, correct? We the people. Certainly you have all heard that before. All right. So I'm going to put all this together. And because this is such an important part of the Declaration, I'm going to give you an easy way to remember it. Okay, so look up on the screen. The Declaration of Independence says, God. God is the source of what? There's actually two things. What's he the source of?
Our laws,
Our laws of natures, and nature's God. What else?
our unalienable rights.
Unalienable rights. That's correct. All right. So God is on the top. Underneath God is the people. What is the people's responsibility that we read about in this part of the Declaration? The people give powers, their consent or powers to the government, correct? And where do we find those powers of government? What document? What document? What is the main thing that I teach about? The Constitution. That's where the people put the powers of government, was into the Constitution. Okay, and then underneath people is government. And what did we say government's job was to do? What's the government's job?
Protect our unalienable rights.
Right, to protect the unalienable rights of the people. All right, so this is the form of government our founders gave us, and it is a biblical model of government. Notice that everything is under the authority of God. Now, unfortunately today, our government is becoming based more and more on a man-made model of government. Most of those in power do not place themselves under the authority of God, do not know the freedom principles of government, or recognize that our rights come from God. So let's take a look at what a man-made model of government looks like. What do you notice about this model compared to the other one? What's on the top here?
Government's on top and not God.
Government's on the top, then the people, and of course there is no God. So if government's on the top, what does the government provide? It decides what? It decides the rights of the people and the laws that govern the land. And then with the people underneath, what's their responsibility? They really have none. Their responsibility is just to be subservient to what the government tells them. So this is what a man-made model of government looks like. So you just got a mini lesson on our nation's law and government. And as you can see, there is a battle going on between the biblical and man-made foundation in this realm too. All right, so now I want to address the battle that is going on in the history of our nation, because that's what our title was. So how is the history of our nation's founding being taught today? Well, instead of teaching America's biblical history by using original source documents, which we have just done, our history is now being taught as an agenda, not based on facts, to promote a secular interpretation of our nation's foundation. Now you might be asking yourself, why in the world would secularists want to do that? Because they know if they can control the past and how people view the past, they can control how people view the future. If they present our nation's foundation as a secular one, then they can replace our current laws and government with a man-made form of government and man-made laws. History, and because you're all historians, you know that history can be a very powerful tool. In fact, Karl Marx, the author of the Communist Manifesto, understood this idea very well when he wrote, "Take away a nation's history, and they are more easily persuaded. And I hate to say that, but that's what's happening in our nation today. So how are secularists changing our history? Well, one of the ways they are changing history is by omitting anything biblical. They call this historical revisionism. And here's an example. So take out your Mayflower Compact. That should be the other document that I gave you. And I want you to take a look at the very first line. Now, just to let you know, this is America's first civil document. Yes, you heard it right. This is America's first civil document. And it was written by the Pilgrims on the Mayflower, which was the name of the ship that brought them to America. Now, the first line in the first paragraph says, "In the name of God, amen." Now look down to the second paragraph. And it says, having undertaken, and they're talking about the voyage that the Pilgrims took, having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith. Now, why did I pick those two phrases? Because today in many of our textbooks, these two lines are removed from the Mayflower Compact. In fact, I've actually had teachers in my classes that have gone and looked and came back and told me, yes, indeed, that was true. Now, because today in many of our textbooks, these two lines are removed from the Mayflower Compact. But why? Because it does not support the secular agenda of those writing our textbooks. Again, they omit anything biblical. Now, this is just a side note, but I want to mention it because it supports the biblical foundation of our nation. Did you notice that last line that we read? Having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith. The Pilgrims were actually interested in establishing a nation for the purpose of advancing the Christian faith. So this biblical foundation of our nation started very early. But the Mayflower Compact is an important document not only for that reason, but because it also set the course for the form of government our nation would later establish. Now look in line 4 of the same paragraph. It should be underlined. And it says, you see where I'm at? The Pilgrims would covenant and combine themselves together into a civil body politic. This means the Pilgrims came together and formed a self-government, not a government under the rule of a king, but, what did we say before? A government by the people. So the Pilgrims established our nation's form of government when they wrote the Mayflower Compact. We already read in the Declaration that the founders established a government by the people, but they called it something different. Remember, we read it was consent of the governed, but it all means the same thing. And it started here in the Mayflower Compact. And does anybody know how the preamble of our Constitution starts? Because they carried it through. Right, Jerry. We the people. So that theme was carried on into our Constitution. Now, what is so tragic is that America's schools used to teach these biblical freedom principles of government and law, and even taught classes on the Constitution. In fact, I have an 1828 reprint of an elementary school book on the Constitution. Now, if you want to take a look at it afterwards, I would, because you know what? Most adults could not answer the questions in this book, yet this was an elementary school book on the Constitution. And in addition to teaching on the Constitution, they also thought it was very important to teach on religion and morality. In fact, that would be the Christian religion and morality. And they thought it was so very important, our founders, that they placed it into another American document called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Now, have any of you ever heard of that document before? All right, well, the reason for that document is territories that were northwest of the original 13 colonies, they had to, and if they wanted to become a state, they actually had to follow what was in that document. Well, I'm about to read you what was required for education in those territories. And guess what? Ohio was part of that territory, right? And the very first school under the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 was actually Ohio University. Okay? And this is what it says. Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. Now, what was exciting to Joe and I when we happened to walk around that campus in Ohio University, we didn't know it was the first university of the Northwest Territory. We found this statement on a plaque on the very first building that was erected for Ohio University. So now I don't know if it's still there today. That was a number of years ago that we went, but that was really exciting to me because I had just started teaching all this, and to find that on a building was exciting for me. Now, just to show you how important it was to our founders to teach religion and morality in our schools, here is another reprint of an 1890s book called Ethics. And this is, wow, a tremendous book, and you're welcome to look at that after the lecture as well. Now, I'm sorry to report that in our current Ohio Social Studies standards, this sentence that we just read reads like this: schools and the means of education were to be encouraged. That's how we teach. So what did they leave out? Well, let's go back and see what they left out. This is what they left out. Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind. So this is another example of removing anything biblical. So now I want to discuss another example of historical revisionism. But this is a little bit different. In this case, they are not just omitting facts of history, but they are completely rewriting it. This technique is called faction, which is fiction made to resemble facts. Again, it is not written using facts, but is written to support and promote an agenda. Now, this example I'm about to tell you about is a fairly recent example. This publication of history, supported and endorsed by the New York Times, came out in August of 2019. It is called the 1619 Project. Have you heard of it?
Yes.
The 16, you have heard about it. Okay. Now, the 1619 Project has been adopted in all 50 of our states. It's also being promoted in the general population as well. Do any of you have Hulu? The streaming service, Hulu on your TV? Okay, well, we do. And it just so happens, one day I brought it up, and it showed that they put together a 6-part series called the 1619 Project. And there's also a children's book called Born on the Water that is based on this curriculum. Now, Nicole Hannah-Jones is the author of the 1619 history curriculum, who, by the way, is not a historian. And this is what she said about the goal of the 1619 Project. She said, it is to reframe American history by considering what it would mean to regard 1619 as our nation's birth year. Doing so requires us to place the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the story we tell ourselves about who we are as a country. And then she went on to say that the ultimate goal of the 1619 Project is a reparations bill. That is the agenda. So instead of 1776 being the origin of our nation's founding when the Declaration was written, the 1619 Project actually puts our nation's true founding in 1619, the year African slaves were first brought to Jamestown, and insists that, and this is a direct quote from their literature, that out of slavery grew nearly everything that has truly made America exceptional. Its economic might, its industrial power, and its electoral system. Now, according to this statement, this is what made America exceptional. Now, I don't want to take away from African Americans because what they did contribute was important. But what we do need to do is balance it by teaching the biblical freedom principles that we have talked about tonight. Those are important too, and we're not teaching those anymore. Now, I do have to say, there are some flaws in this interpretation of America, and here is the first one. The slaves that they said came to Jamestown in 1619, guess what? They were not treated as slaves. They were treated as indentured servants. And the reason that happened was because Jamestown did not request for slaves to be dropped off to Jamestown. They were actually just receiving stolen cargo from a stolen ship that wanted to get rid of their cargo quickly. So when they were dropped off, they really didn't know how to treat them. But they did have laws based on indentured servants. Now, you know what I mean by indentured servants, right? Those were people who had their passageway paid for by a person, and then they worked for that person until they had paid off their debt. So really, what happened was these laws said that they were to be released after 7 years. They were given their freedom, and many times their own land. So anyways, and this continued for many decades too. It wasn't that they were treated as slaves for quite a while. And I don't know, have you ever heard anything about the Pilgrims in slavery? Because I feel like this is very important as well. The first time a slave ship pulled into Plymouth, guess what the leaders of the Plymouth colony did? They actually arrested the captain of the ship, put him in jail, and they paid money to have those slaves taken back to their country of origin. So see, those are the stories that we're not hearing about, but to me are very important. All right, now here is another flaw in the 1619 Project. The author claims that the American Revolution was fought primarily to preserve slavery. And here is her quote. This is right out of their curriculum. Conveniently left out of our founding mythology, so she's charging that all the history we have taught up until now is based just on myth, is the fact that one of the primary reasons the colonists decided to declare their independence from Britain was because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. Now, there was a lot of pushback on this statement, so 7 months later in the New York Times, it issued a clarification saying this passage had been adjusted, and it added 2 words to the quote. It now says, some of the colonists wanted to protect the institution of slavery. But even that is still incorrect, and I'm going to prove it to you because, and if you don't believe anything I say, go and check it out for yourself. Go to the original source documents. But if you take out your paper on the Declaration of Independence, and I get more into this in my 12-week class, you'll notice that there are 27 grievances listed in the Declaration of Independence. They're grievances against King George III and England. And if you were to read through all of that list, or the reasons why the colonists separated, you would not find the protection of slavery in there. The truth is that some of the northern colonies did want to abolish slavery. This is when they are under England and King George III, but he would not let them do it. So if the colonists had not declared independence from England, slavery in the colonies would not have been threatened at all. In fact, few people know that Thomas Jefferson, who was one of the primary or the primary writer of the Declaration, he wrote in his initial draft of the Declaration a grievance against King George of England for perpetuating the transatlantic slave trade. So, look up on the screen. This is actually what he originally wrote, but it was removed. It says, he, meaning King George III, has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. That's a word we don't hear much today, is it? Thither. Okay, so feel free to take that Declaration of Independence paper home with you and read the grievances for yourself. Now, I just want you to know that there has been pushback against the 1619 curriculum, and there has been other curriculum that has been written to counter it. Okay, there was some curriculum written by the 1776 Commission, which was done by Hillsdale College. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. They are up in Michigan. They are actually one of the few colleges in America that actually teaches the Constitution still, the original intent of the Constitution. There's something called the 1776 Unites that was written by scholars from the Woodson Center. And then there's Bill Bennett, who was our Secretary of Education under Ronald Reagan, who also wrote an American history curriculum called America, the Last Best Hope. So there are some places that you can go to find another interpretation or the history of America. All right, so here is another example of how education has become devoid of biblical freedom principles and the history our nation was founded upon. In Ohio's current social studies standards, our children are being taught that Enlightenment principles are what impacted the Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, and our Bill of Rights, which, by the way, includes religious freedom, right? That's in our First Amendment. But here's the irony of religious freedom being an Enlightenment principle. The Enlightenment was a godless revolution in France that rejected religious faith, executed over 17,000 people, you've all heard of the guillotine, right? And valued human reason or man's truth alone. So what is happening now is that historical revisionists are not just omitting biblical freedom principles from our textbooks, they are purposely teaching lies. And here are the Ohio Social Studies standards directly from the source. All right, it says, I'm just going to go over the first part of it just so you can see. The Declaration reflects an application of Enlightenment ideas. The framers of the Constitution applied ideas of Enlightenment. The Bill of Rights is derived from English law, ideas of the Enlightenment. So what is the result of all this historical revisionism? Well, according to the latest survey from Harvard's Institute of Politics, only 31% of young Americans, this is from 18 to 29, believe in American exceptionalism, meaning they are not being taught why America has been and is the most free and prosperous nation in the world. And not only are our young people missing out on the truth of their American heritage, but they are being taught to hate America. Instead of teaching our young people to be grateful for living in a country which has almost eliminated poverty and has been the most generous nation in the history of the world, we are teaching them to be resentful for living in a prosperous country. Instead of teaching our young people that slavery has existed since the beginning of history, and America's founders were some of the first people to discuss eradicating it, and did end it in many of the states, we are instead teaching them that they were oppressors who owned slaves. Now, I'm not here to say that our forefathers were perfect or without flaws, because they certainly were. They're people, right? We all have flaws. And some of them were slave owners, but not all of them. In fact, many of them were vehemently opposed to slavery and started abolitionist societies. Now, I'm also not here to say that our American history was without flaws, because that would not be the truth either. But our history needs to be balanced with both the bad and the good. But here's what I do want to say. If we continue to teach our young people only the flaws of our history and don't teach them the freedom principles that gave us freedom and prosperity, we are going to lose both of them. The main purpose of history and government classes should be to teach the next generation how to live in liberty and how liberty came about in this nation. All right, so now we're going to shift gears. So how did our forefathers view history? They viewed it very differently from us. Instead of studying history as a bunch of meaningless facts and dates like we often do today, our forefathers had a much deeper and richer understanding of history. And believe it or not, they got it from the Bible. Isaiah 46 verses 9 through 11 is a good place that you can go to find that. And they understood history from a biblical perspective in which God is sovereign or in control of history, and he is constantly looking for those whose purposes line up with his. Now, Daniel Webster, I'm sure you've all heard of him. You've probably heard of Noah Webster too, but two very different people. Daniel Webster was an American statesman. He was a congressman and a proclaimed orator of the early 1800s. In fact, he was a lawyer, and he had such a good reputation that many times if lawyers found out that they were going to have to be up against him, they dropped it. they were afraid to argue a case against him. But this is how Daniel Webster expressed the biblical worldview of history. This is what he said. History is God's providence in human affairs. Now, I want you to remember that word providence, because you are going to hear that word over and over again in the statements that I'm going to read to you tonight. So we can say history is, in the most literal sense, God's story or his story. History. Let's see. Now, what our pilgrim forefathers and founders understood, I'm looking to see how much time we have. I don't want to keep you here too long. Okay. Was that they were a part of God's plan in history, and that his hand was guiding them and helping them in their journey. Now, our pilgrim forefathers spoke often of the providence of God, but I don't have time to tell their story. But what I do want to say is this about the pilgrims. The pilgrims suffered many hardships in coming to America. In fact, they lost almost half their number the first winter that they arrived. But they also saw God's hand helping them in many ways. It's what would help them get through their hardships. Now, the captain of the ship, who remained anchored until the next spring, begged the pilgrims to return with him. because he didn't think they were going to survive. But how many do you think returned? What do you think? None. Why do you think that is?
They had their freedom.
Right, they had their freedom, but they also thought that this was God's providence for them, that this was his plan for their life to be there. Remember what it said in the Mayflower Compact, to bring the advancement of the gospel to America. Now, this is something that William Bradford, who was the second governor of Plymouth Colony, this is what he would write in his diary. He said, this is what he wrote about the Pilgrims. But these things did not dismay them, though they did sometimes trouble them. For their desires were set on the ways of God and to enjoy his ordinances. But they rested on his providence and knew whom they had believed. You see, the Pilgrims understood they were a part of God's larger story. It wasn't about them and their own personal story. It was about accomplishing the purposes and plan of God. William Bradford would also write this. This is your ancestor, Jerry. Last and not least, they cherished a great hope and inward zeal of laying good foundations, or at least of making some way towards it, for the propagations and advance of the gospel of the kingdom of Christ in the remote parts of the world, even though they should be but stepping stone to others in the performance of so great a work. So, the Pilgrims had a generational perspective. They knew that they might not see the fruits of all their labor, but future generations would. They saw themselves as stepping stones for a much greater plan. They were laying a good foundation for the advancement of the gospel, and they were also laying a good foundation for America's form of government, laws, education, and liberty. Now, a little over 150 years later, our founders would also speak about the providence of God and founded our nation upon the same biblical foundation that our Pilgrim forefathers brought to America. The men who signed the Declaration of Independence ended it with this statement. So if you would take out your handout again, look at the very last line in the Declaration of Independence. All right, you with me? It says, let's read it together. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes,
and our
sacred honor. So let me ask you, have you ever thought about the sacrifices those men made by signing the Declaration? Well, I can tell you, they certainly thought about it, and they knew the risks they were making. Treason against England was death by hanging. They also knew that in standing up to the most powerful military force in the world at that time, their courage and resolve would be tested in the days, months, and years following the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So they wrote this statement that we just read in the very last line of the Declaration. Now let me ask you, at this point, I have a video that takes about 8 minutes long. We can either watch it or we cannot watch it. What would you like to do? You would like to watch it. Okay. All right. So here in this video clip is Paul Harvey, who gives an account of the importance of the signer's statement and captures the essence of just what it meant when they signed the Declaration.
Americans, the how and the why of our beloved republic are so much better known and understood than the who. The United States of America was born in 1776, but it was conceived 169 years before that. The earliest settlers had watered the New World with much sweat. They had built substantial holdings for themselves, for their families. And when the time came to separate themselves from a tyranny an ocean away, at best it meant starting all over again after the ravages of war. Researching what you're about to hear gave a whole new dimension to my reverence for our nation's first citizens. All others of the world's revolutions, before and since, were initiated by men who had nothing to lose. Nothing to lose. Our founders had everything to lose and nothing to gain, except one thing. Hello, Americans, I'm Paul Harvey. You may not be able to quote one line from the Declaration of Independence at this moment. Henceforth, you'll always be able to quote at least one line. It's in the last paragraph where you will recall when I remind you. It says, "We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." In the Pennsylvania State House that's now called Independence Hall in Philadelphia, the best men from each of the colonies sat down together. This was a very fortunate hour in our nation's history, one of those rare occasions in the lives of men when we had greatness to spare. These were men of means, well-educated. 24 were lawyers and jurists. 9 were farmers, owners of large plantations. On June 11, a committee sat down to draw up a Declaration of Independence. We were going to tell the British fatherland, no more rule by redcoats. Below the dam of ruthless foreign rule, the stream of freedom was running shallow and muddy. And we were going to light a fuse to dynamite that dam. This pact, as Burke later put it, was a partnership between the living and the dead and the yet unborn. There was no bigotry, there was no demagoguery in this group. All had shared hardships. Jefferson finished a draft of the document in 17 days. Congress adopted it in July, and so much is familiar history. But now, King George III had denounced all rebels in America as traitors. Punishment for treason was hanging. The names now so familiar to you from the several signatures on that Declaration of Independence, the names were kept secret for 6 months, for each knew the full meaning of that magnificent last paragraph in which his signature pledged his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor. 56 men placed their names beneath that pledge. 56 men knew when they signed that they were risking everything. They knew if they won this fight, the best they could expect would be years of hardship and a struggling nation. And if they lost, they'd face a hangman's rope. But they signed the pledge. And here is the documented fate of that gallant 56. Carter Braxton of Virginia, wealthy planter, trader, saw his ships swept from the seas. To pay his debts, he lost his home and all of his properties and died in rags. Thomas Lynch Jr., who signed that pledge, was a third-generation rice grower, aristocrat, large plantation owner. After he signed, his health failed. His wife and he set out for France to regain his failing health. Their ship never got to France, was never heard from again. Thomas McKean of Delaware was so harassed by the enemy that he was forced to move his family 5 times in 5 months. He served in Congress without pay, his family in poverty and in hiding. Vandals looted the properties of Ellery and Clymer and Hall and Gwinnett and Walton and Hayward and Rutledge and Middleton. Thomas Nelson Jr. of Virginia raised $2 million on his own signature to provision our allies, the French fleet. After the war, he personally paid back the loans, wiped out his entire estate, and he was never reimbursed by his government. In the final battle for Yorktown, he, Nelson, urged General Washington to fire on his, Nelson's, own home, which was occupied by Cornwallis. It was destroyed. Thomas Nelson Jr. had pledged his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor. The Hessians seized the home of Francis Hopkinson of New Jersey. Francis Lewis had his home and everything destroyed, his wife imprisoned. She died within a few months. Richard Stockton, who signed that declaration, was captured, mistreated, his health broken to the extent that he died at 51. His estate was pillaged. Thomas Hayward Jr. was captured when Charleston fell. John Hart was driven from his wife's bedside while she was dying. Their 13 children fled in all directions for their lives. His fields and grist mill were laid waste. For more than a year, he lived in forests and caves and returned home after the war to find his wife dead, his children gone, his properties gone, and he died a few weeks later of exhaustion and a broken heart. Lewis Morris saw his land destroyed, his family scattered. Philip Livingston died within a few months from the hardships of the war. John Hancock, history remembers best due to a quirk of fate rather than anything he stood for. That great sweeping signature attesting to his vanity towers over the others. One of the wealthiest men in New England. And yet he stood outside Boston one terrible night of the war. And he said, "Burn Boston, though it makes John Hancock a beggar, if the public good requires it." So he too lived up to the pledge. Of the 56, few were long to survive. 5 were captured by the British and tortured before they died. 12 had their homes from Rhode Island to Charleston sacked, looted, occupied by the enemy, or burned. 2 lost their sons in the army. 1 had 2 sons captured. 9 of the 56 died in the war from its hardships or from its more merciful bullets. I don't know what impression you had of the men who met that summer in Philadelphia. But I think it's important that we remember this about them. They were not poor men. They were not wild-eyed pirates. These were men of means. They were rich men, most of them, and had enjoyed much ease and luxury in their personal living. Not hungry men, certainly not terrorists, not irresponsible malcontents, not fanatical incendiaries. These men were prosperous men, wealthy landowners. They were substantially secure in their prosperity. They had everything to lose. But they considered liberty, and this is as much as I shall say of it. They had learned that liberty is so much more important than security, that they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And they fulfilled their pledge. They paid the price, and freedom was born.
Okay, gives you a little bit different perspective on what these men went through. In fact, for these men who mutually pledged to each other their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, this was more than really a declaration, more than a document. It was a covenant with God and each other. God himself was a witness of their actions, and he was the one they would look to protect them and bring them through their trials, to establish a nation of liberty. And in the end, even though they suffered much, we heard that in the video, no signer was hung for treason. Yet the signers knew that despite this cost, they were part of something much bigger than themselves. They were laying the foundation for a country in which the people would have the rights God intended them to have. So you can understand, after watching this video, why this next statement about our founders in a current AP government textbook would literally give me heartburn. It states, as property holders themselves, these delegates could not imagine a government that did not make its principal objective an economic one, the preservation of individual rights to acquire and hold wealth. A few, like Morris, were intent on shutting out the propertyless altogether. But I have to say, if the purpose of the framers was to protect their wealth, as the textbook statement implies, then why were they willing to give up everything they owned when they signed the Declaration? Most of them, as we heard in the video, were wealthy and doing well in life. They had much more to lose than to gain when they signed the Declaration. So what was behind their sacrifice if it wasn't the protection of their wealth? Now, I do have to say, property rights is one of our unalienable rights, so that was definitely a part of it, but I don't think it was the principal objective. Well, John Adams, in a speech to the Continental Congress, summed up the sentiment of those who were there. He said, "All that I have and all that I am, and all that I hope in this life, I am now ready here to stake upon it, that live or die, survive or perish, I am for the Declaration, independence now, and independence forever." So these founders who sacrificed themselves was not for the protection of wealth, because many lost it. These were men who sacrificed themselves for a much higher cause. And what was that? For freedom, right? Liberty. All right, now what I would like to do, and I think this is my favorite part of the lecture, I want to tell some stories about an individual who also sacrificed everything for the establishment of liberty in this nation. He also believed in the providence of God, and his name is George Washington. Now, as I tell this story, I want you to keep in mind, this is very important, that this story of Washington was in almost every history textbook up until 1930. And it is called The Bulletproof George Washington. Has anybody heard of this before? Most people haven't. A few have. So our story begins on July 9th, 1755. Now, I want you to keep in mind, and this is important, that this story took place 21 years before the signing of the Declaration. So it's not General Washington here, it's Lieutenant Colonel George Washington. And this takes place in a battle of the French and Indian War, and he is the only officer left alive in the battle. And because he is the only one left alive, he gets to lead the few remaining soldiers that are left, that's 500 out of 1,500, and he leads them in a retreat to safety. Now, the officers of the battle had all been killed quickly. Do you want to guess why? What did the officers do? They ride on horseback, correct? And so they're riding on horseback against all of the other foot soldiers. And so they're very easy targets. All right, so that's why they were killed so quickly. Now that evening, when they got back to the fort, when Washington took off his coat, he noticed that he had an odd tear in his coat. He examined it more closely and saw that it was a bullet hole. Now he rolled up his sleeve and looked at his arm directly under the hole, and there was not a mark on his skin. Not only that, but he discovered 3 more bullet holes in his coat. And this is what he would write his brother about the event. Okay, so this is a letter to his brother. He says, "By the all-powerful dispensations of providence," remember I said we hear that word often, "I have been protected beyond all human probability or expectation. For I had 4 bullet holes through my coat, and 2 horses shot under me, yet escaped unhurt, although death was leveling my companions on every side of me." Now that is not the end of the story. It gets better. 15 years later, in 1770, this is now 6 years prior to the signing of the Declaration, Washington returned to the place of the battle, which is near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania today. The Indian chief who had been the leader of the battle against Washington heard that he was coming and traveled a long way to meet him. And this is what the Indian chief had to say. This is what was recorded. It says, "I am a chief and ruler over my tribes. My influence extends to the waters of the Great Lakes and to the far blue mountains. I have traveled a long and weary path that I might see the young warrior of a great battle. It was on the day when the white man's blood mixed with the streams of our forests that I first beheld this chief, and he pointed to Washington. I called to my young men and said, "Mark yon tall and daring warrior. Quick, let your aim be certain," and he dies. Our rifles were leveled, rifles which but for you knew not how to miss. 'Twas all in vain. A power far mightier than we shielded you. Seeing you were under the special guardianship of the Great Spirit, we immediately ceased to fire at you. Now I am old and shall soon be gathered to the great council fire of my fathers in the land of the shades. But before I go, there is something bids me speak in the voice of prophecy. Listen, the Great Spirit protects that man, and he points to Washington, and guides his destinies. He will become the chief of nations, and a people yet unborn will hail him as the founder of a mighty empire. I have come to pay homage to the man who is the particular favorite of heaven and who can never die in battle. Don't you think it might be a little different if we read those stories to our children today? Now, in all the battles that Washington fought, including the Revolutionary War, Washington was never once wounded in battle. And in the years after this miraculous event occurred, George Washington would be asked over and over again to serve his country. First as the leader of the Continental Army, then as a representative in the Continental Congress, and then as President of the United States. And always he wanted to go back to his beloved home of Mount Vernon. But then he remembered this prophecy and remembered how God had divinely protected him, and he always chose to serve. Now, this experience of God's providence was not wasted on George Washington. He wrote in his diary during the War for Independence that at least 67 times, when the army would have suffered disaster and defeat, God intervened on their behalf. And now I'd like to tell you one more story, and then we'll wrap it up. Now, this story took place only 6 weeks after the Continental Congress had signed the Declaration. And George Washington and his army were surrounded and outnumbered by the British with the East River at his back. Are y'all familiar with this battle? Okay, they were in deep trouble. They didn't have enough ammunition or men to fight, but surrender was out of the question. When a lieutenant asked, "What are we going to do?" and Washington replied with this. He said, "We will firmly rely on the protection of divine providence. God has not brought us this far to desert us." And little did the officers know they were about to see the most amazing episode of divine intervention in the Revolutionary War. The Americans waited all afternoon and no attack came. The night passed quietly. They waited all the next day as well. Why had the British not attacked? They clearly outnumbered the Americans. Perhaps they were waiting for the winds to change so their warships could join in the battle. Now, while Washington waited, he was inspired with a daring plan. By night, they would secretly evacuate the entire army, 8,000 men, across the East River. It was a desperate move. The East River was a mile wide, and wouldn't the British see them in the moonlight or hear the splashing of their oars? Not to mention the sounds that 8,000 men would make, no matter how quiet they tried to be. Was it a coincidence that just the day before, a regiment of Massachusetts fishermen had come over to reinforce Washington's army? They were joined by equally skilled mariners from Salem. Together they would gather the necessary rowboats, and then all night long, they would make the dangerous 2-mile round trip, rowing expertly and soundlessly back and forth. Now listen to this part. Their boats were loaded not only with men, but supplies, cannons, carts, cattle, and horses. Now how do you do that quietly? I don't know. But as the next day dawned, the retreat was far from complete. At least 3 more hours were needed. Major Talmadge's unit was among those who remained. And this is how Major Talmadge described the scene. So this is written in his diary. He says, at this time a very dense fog began to rise out of the ground and off the river, and it seemed to settle in a peculiar manner over both encampments. Now I recollect this providential occurrence very well, and so very dense was the atmosphere that I could scarcely discern a man at 6 yards distance. We tarried until the sun had risen, but the fog remained as dense as ever. Against all odds, the fog remained until the last boat with General Washington in it had left the shore. As the fog lifted, the British were shocked to find the American trenches completely empty. They ran to the shore and started firing on the last 4 boats, which were now out of range of their guns. By the time the British were able to move their cannons into position, the Americans had completely escaped. Now, did you notice who was the last one to leave? Who was it? George Washington. He was in the very last boat. And I want to read one more thing. This was actually part of President George Washington's inaugural address, and this is what he wrote. He said, "No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than the people of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency."
Yeah.
So what you have heard is a biblical view of history, the providence of God in human affairs. God had a plan for our nation, and he found those who would fulfill his purposes, starting with the Pilgrims and then the founders. So why did I spend time telling you about a biblical view of history? Well, first I wanted you to see how the forefathers viewed history in this nation. But I also told you these stories because I think we can learn from them. We need to see ourselves as part of history, just like our forefathers did, and then ask ourselves, what part of history can I be a part of? Now, our nation is at a crossroads, and we are dangerously close to losing our freedoms. The secularists who propose man-made government and man-made laws in this country are winning the battle, especially for the hearts of the next generation. This would not be so dire if the principles they espouse led to freedom, but they do not. Man-made principles have been tried over and over throughout history, and they have always led to the same thing: tyranny. So I believe you with this. If you choose to be a soldier in this battle to preserve America's true history and ultimately freedom, then what will be your part to do so? Thank you.